following President Trump's threat to use active duty troops to combat protests and his administration's violent clearing of a peaceful protest for a photo op. The Washington Post reported that a number of CIA veterans who monitored crackdowns abroad see troubling parallels in President Trump's handling of the protests. The report reads this way: the scenes have been disturbingly familiar to CIA analysts accustomed to monitoring scenes of societal unraveling abroad. The massing of protesters, the ensuing crackdowns, and the awkwardly staged displays of strength by a leader determined to project authority. In interviews and posts on social media in recent days, current and former U.S. intelligence officials have expressed dismay at the similarity between events at home and the signs of decline or democratic regression they were trained to detect in other nations. One of those former CIA analysts is Gail Helt. She was responsible for tracking developments in China and Southeast Asia and told the Post she has seen this kind of violence before, saying, quote, "This is what autocrats do. This is what happens in countries before a collapse. It really does unnerve me." And Gail joins us now. She is now a professor at King University in Tennessee. Also with us this morning, author of the book entitled Surviving Autocracy, staff writer at The New Yorker, Masha Gessen, and author and staff writer at The Atlantic, Anne Applebaum. Her recent piece for the magazine is entitled History Will Judge the Complicit, in which she argues that Republican leaders abandon their principles in support of a, quote, immoral and dangerous president. Gail, let me begin with you and your quote to the Washington Post about the parallels you see in the United States today and what you've seen abroad over many years. What specifically concerns you here?
Well, I think it culminated for me a little bit after I made those comments, actually. But when I saw President Trump walk to the front of that church after he violently cleared protesters, standing there holding up a Bible, it just reminded me of every image I've seen, for example, of Kim Jong-un standing on the top of Mount Paktu or sitting on that white horse, and the imagery that it conjured. When Kim Jong-un does that, it's to conjure a divine image, and that's what it seemed like Donald Trump was doing, and that really, really unnerved me. And that comes on at the end of 3 years of him eroding our trust in our democratic institutions, eroding the institutions themselves. We don't believe our press anymore. We don't believe in our intelligence community anymore. We don't respect our civil servants anymore. Donald Trump doesn't respect the Constitution anymore. And all of those things coming together, honestly, I'm terrified.
Anne Applebaum, we've been talking about your extraordinary piece in The Atlantic for some time, and it seems to underline the fact that our founders, they anticipated an out-of-control chief executive. They anticipated an out-of-control president. In fact, they put in Madisonian safeguards to make sure that there were checks and balances to check would-be tyrants. What they never imagined in their darkest dreams, their worst scenarios, would be a compliant Congress. That's what you were actually talking about yesterday on Twitter, and also what your piece delved into. How concerned should we be?
Well, I think very concerned. And, the issue is not just the compliant Congress. It's also compliant top officials. We are used to the idea that certain institutions in a liberal democracy are nonpartisan. The State Department, the Army, the CIA, these are institutions that serve whoever is in power, no matter, what he or she does, whichever political party they serve to. Since he has taken over the White House, Trump has sought to change the nature of these institutions and make them answerable to him alone. That's what we saw on Lafayette Square when he tried to use the army and to evoke, use army leaders beside him to evoke the idea that somehow the army was on his side, that it was a partisan institution. That's what we see when he downgrades, when he insults the CIA, when he insults the FBI. And the fact that leaders of those institutions, and as you say, leaders of Congress, have not fought back, have not stood out, have not tried to object to any of this. This is an important sign of democratic decline. These are people who are no longer willing, because of a variety of reasons that I described in the article, no longer willing to stand up for institutions that they know are being damaged and for values that they know are right.
Anne, could you have ever imagined, and this is not a leading question, I'm just curious, because I didn't ever imagine, and I guess it's just a great lack of imagination on my part, but did you ever imagine an American president in this time first attacking the press as enemies of the people like Stalin did, then attacking an independent federal judiciary, questioning the legitimacy of federal judges when they ruled against his travel bans, his Muslim bans, and then attacking our intelligence agencies, vicious attacks against the CIA, the FBI, and the Republican Party standing quietly by as he did it, acquiescing.
Yes, look, there are reasons why he's attacking those kinds of institutions, because those are the institutions that are capable of holding him to account. You know, the free press can investigate whether or not his companies are making money off his presidency. The judiciary can turn down or counter things that he says or laws that he passes. You know, and his attempt to limit those institutions is in a way of trying to expand his power. Everybody who's in Congress right now knows that. This is not a question of, you know, people in the world who might vote for Trump because they don't pay much attention to politics and the economy was doing great before and so on. No, these are people who understand the Constitution extremely well. They know that Trump has overstepped the bounds. Many of them say so off the record. Many of them say so to their Democratic colleagues in Congress. Nevertheless, they have been unwilling, a combination of desire to be close to power, fear of losing power themselves, desire to conform, fear of being embarrassed or attacked on Twitter, and sometimes using even a kind of Vichyite argument, which is that the other side is worse. In other words, we have to collaborate with Donald Trump no matter what he does, because the left is so dangerous and so negative and so damaging to American life that we have to prevent it. This is the kind of argument that has been used in occupied countries in the past. This is how, when France was occupied by the Nazis, this is how Vichy, these were the Nazi collaborators in France, this is how they justified what they did. We have to collaborate with Germany because the alternative is so much worse.
Masha Gessen, you have been a consistent and courageous critic of Vladimir Putin and his regime in Russia, and it does take real courage, as we know, to be a consistent critic of Vladimir Putin. What do you see in the streets of America over the last 10 days as someone who has studied autocracy abroad?
What I'm seeing is the performance of fascism. Donald Trump, I think, is showing us, and he has told us before, but it's never been quite as clear and quite as frightening. He's showing us what he thinks power looks like and sounds like. He thinks that power looks like unidentified troops on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial or guarding the White House. And this, I think, is particularly frightening. We're seeing this display of military force and a display of refusal to be accountable in any way. The fact that these troops are refusing to identify themselves, the fact that they're unmarked, is absolutely terrifying to me. He thinks that power looks like Black Hawk helicopters being used to clear protesters. He thinks it looks like tear gas being used to clear protesters. He thinks it sounds like the word dominate, which he repeated over and over again on his phone call with governors. And this is a performance of power, and it's a performance of fascism. Right? Everything that we know about fascism, it is power that is concentrated in the hands of one nation, one race, and it brutally suppresses dissent. We're seeing that now. He has chosen his role, whether he's capable of grasping the concept or not.
So, Masha, you've described this as a performance of fascism. What comes next in the practice of fascism, and do you see that headed in this direction?
I don't make predictions, but I can tell you what we are observing. What we're observing, a power grab always begins as a performance, right? A claim is made, and then the autocrat sees, or the aspiring autocrat sees, whether the claim is accepted, right? Whether the performance is believed. That's what we're asking right now, and I think that the signs are extremely worrisome. We have seen some voices from the military object to this claim to unitary power and to the right to use military force in the United States, but we have not seen an appropriate reaction from Congress. We have not seen an insurrection within the White House, which is what we should be seeing. We should be seeing this power claim being rejected.
So, Gail, we have seen some of the military pushing back. We've seen federal judges over the past several years, including judges described as conservatives, pushing back against Donald Trump's unconstitutional reaches of power. And we've seen quite a few bureaucrats, inspectors generals who ultimately got fired, doing the same thing. But I am wondering whether, as we look at what Donald Trump's done over the past 3.5 years, and whether we look forward to a time past Donald Trump in the White House, whether we need to figure out how to rely less on norms, less on constitutional norms, less on political norms, and actually instead put more laws on the book that actually constrains a president in a way that would have been helpful over the past 3.5 years, be that president Democratic or Republican.
I think that there is something to that. I do believe that putting more laws on the books would definitely be beneficial. Having something concrete to actually, throw up there when, God forbid, another president down the road takes an authoritarian turn. But I don't want to minimize the importance of these norms and especially American values. We used to have values that would have deterred a president from behaving in this way. We had a fairly tightly knit, even though it's flawed, societal fabric. And over the years, that's weakened a little bit, but Donald Trump has pretty much unraveled it. But that societal fabric basically are the American values that we hold dear, and those values place our Constitution pretty much above all else. And yet, over the last 3 years, Americans themselves don't really value the Constitution, because if they did, there would be public outcry over Trump's behavior. And I want to see us kind of rally around our founding values and documents more, and I'm hoping that the next administration will be able to facilitate that.
And you challenged General Mattis to speak out. Yesterday, you challenged Republican leaders to speak out, who should be speaking out given their backgrounds. Are you hopeful that that's going to happen? Are you hopeful that the institutions will hold for the next 6 months?
Well, as you know, General Mattis did speak out after the article was published. I can't take credit for that, obviously, but he and a number of other senior generals do seem to have been very alarmed, and I'm glad they're speaking, because those are voices that have a lot of influence on the side that matters, namely the side, the group of Americans who support the president. Let me answer your question in a slightly sideways way by responding partly to the one that you asked Masha Gessen, which is what would come next. And the answer is, in a lot of illiberalizing countries, or in countries that cease to be democracies, what comes next is the attempt to steal an election. And what I hope all Americans will be focused on over the next several months is, will Trump and will the Republican Party collaborate in an attempt to steal this election? Will they try to change the rules? Will they mess around with distance voting? Will they, exacerbate the problems caused by the pandemic to prevent people from voting? That's the thing that's going to happen next. And the real test for the Republican Party is, will they, do they value democracy in America enough to allow a real election to go through and to allow themselves to lose. And to that point, while I think there'll be a few people who will break out of it, I'm doubtful as to whether we can rely on the party leadership.
And the president's already working hard to discredit mail-in voting, to your point. Ann Applebaum at The Atlantic, Gail Helt, former CIA analyst, and Masha Gessen of The New Yorker. Masha is the author of the new book, Surviving Autocracy. Thank you all for this conversation. Good to have you with us. Coming up next on Morning Joe, Senator Tom Cotton calls for a military response to the protests across the nation. Talk about that when we come right back on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.